And maybe Leah, if you could keep admitting people in the waiting room, that would be great. I'm going to start to share my screen. So I got a sense a little bit of where folks are coming from age-wise, right? We're mostly, I saw a lot of 8th grade and 7th grade, a couple high schoolers too, so that's great. And kind of throughout the presentation today, I'm going to ask if you guys could do me a huge favor and just really keep engaging in the chat. If you can keep your chat up when you're looking at the screen, I'll keep it up for me too. And can you guys see that okay? Can you just put in the chat a yes or no if you can see me sharing my screen? Okay, great. It's looking like that's working. You're not seeing the screen yet. Okay. Oh, yep, there we go. Now it's working out. Awesome. Thank you so much, guys, for helping me out with that. I appreciate that. And if everyone can put themselves on mute too, I could scroll through, but that sounds great. Thanks, guys. Okay, so I'm gonna put this into full screen. Always takes me a second. Okay, great.
Take some notes if you have to.
And okay, so hey everyone, good afternoon. So my name is Grace Woodward, and I'm coming to chat with you guys from Maryland Humanities, mostly about Maryland History Day. So I think it seems like most of you guys are pretty far involved in your project. You've probably heard of History Day. You maybe have some ideas about your topic, or you've at least started to cover it in class a little bit as well, which is great. That's exactly where folks should be at. And I'm excited to talk to you a little about getting into the next steps of History Day. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do secondary research online. So in the chat, have you guys heard of secondary sources? Are people familiar with that? Do you know what a secondary source is? Can anyone tell me a little bit about what a secondary source means? What is that? What's a secondary source? If you can put that in the chat. Maybe even an example of a source or a definition of secondary. A source made after the event. Great, exactly. A source made about something wasn't from that same time. From people who weren't at the event. Yeah, a textbook is a great example. Someone not involved. Okay, awesome. So you guys definitely have a pretty good hold on what a secondary source is. So that's great. I'm gonna zoom through that part of my presentation a little bit. It seems like you guys have that down. Let's see. Oh, okay. So secondary source, right? It's just like we were mentioning, it's a secondhand account. So it's made by someone who did not participate in the historical period we're studying. So it's someone who wasn't at the event we're talking about, someone who wasn't necessarily directly involved. Another part that's important to me to understand about secondary sources is that their analyses or interpretations of information based on primary sources. So they're not just someone saying what happened, but there's someone saying what happened, why they think it happened, different reasons, other kinds of analysis, similar to how your History Day projects will analyze history, analyze the why and the how. Secondary sources do that same kind of work. So those can be things like biographies and documentaries and textbooks and websites. They're things that people create to analyze historical events. So similarly, just so we get clear, right, the differences between primary sources and secondary sources, today we're going to focus on secondary sources. We can't really have secondary sources without primary sources, right? Primary sources are really important for history. They're kind of like the raw materials of history. They're things that are made during the event. They're original documents or objects created by someone at the time or involved in a historical moment. And they're important to understand in the terms of secondary sources, in particular, because they are what allow secondary sources to get written, right? They're the pieces that secondary sources will build off of. Great, so these are some questions that I like to show folks to really help us determine the difference between primary and secondary sources. Well, there are some that feel really easy to identify. There are some that are a little more challenging. And sometimes a second or a primary source might change based on your topic. The big one for me that I think is really helpful is secondary sources are often going to have footnotes or citations, and those footnotes and citations can help us find other primary sources and also other secondary sources. So that's a little bit of what we're going to focus on today. These questions, we don't have to go through them all in a lot of detail, but there's some of those main differences, right? It's a primary source if the source is created by someone about their own firsthand experiences. It's probably a secondary source if it's covering the firsthand experience of someone else. And like you guys are saying, it's a lot about whether it was created during the time or after the time. So there's a question in the source, right, about why are secondary sources with citations are easier to find than primary source citations? So I like to think about it this way, right? So like a primary source might be a letter. I could write a letter to a friend and that would be a primary source from my lifetime, but I'm not going to put footnotes in that letter. I might not reference how I got this information. That's going to be, it's more informal. It's going to be something from my time and my moment. And that whereas secondary source is analysis of things like letters and newspapers. So they're going to cite those things that they analyze. They're going to cite the things that they review and talk about in their project or in their paper or whatever kind of secondary source you're looking at. So that's why secondary sources might have citations, whereas primary sources won't have citations. Primary sources won't have like footnotes. That is a great question. How do we know that secondary or primary sources are reliable? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in this presentation. Okay, so before we get to that part, just a quick, can you tell me which of these is the secondary source and which one's the primary source? You can just go by color. Is the yellow the secondary or the primary, or is the pink? So which one is the primary source? The pink or the yellow? Yep, great. Oh, it looks like maybe it's red on some folks' screen, but exactly. And what about, and so exactly, you guys did great. So the pink is that primary source and the yellow is the secondary, right? So we're seeing that the primary source is this piece and yellow is the analysis. It's telling us outside information about our primary source. Awesome. You guys crushed that one. There's our primary and our secondary sources. So when we're thinking about History Day projects, we talk a lot about why primary sources are important. We talk about how primary sources can help us understand History Day topics and help us make historical arguments, but it's also really important to use secondary sources. And this is a little bit of why. Secondary sources can help us better understand both historical context and multiple perspectives. And that will help us build the story we're trying to tell throughout our History Day project. So something that's important to think about in this kind of idea, right? We're thinking multiple perspectives. We might think about different kinds of authors, different important historical thinkers, different people who are going to be able to tell us more about our topic, even if they weren't there. And historical context, because a lot of secondary sources are going to come from historians, they might be able to tell us about other parts of history that are relevant because they can like look back, right? They get that 20/20 vision. They get to look back at the event and think more critically about it than someone who necessarily was a part of it. So they're kind of helping us get that big picture view of our History Day topics and our History Day projects. Okay, great. So this is an example of how secondary sources really connect to History Day in particular. History Day, we use these kinds of evaluation forms, right? We have new evaluation forms this year. You might have seen these in class. They might be new to you. It's not the most important part, but it's basically like a rubric. This is how projects are judged, what judges are looking for in their History Day projects. So there's two in particular. This is the new one, yep. Great question. So this one in particular, I think really shows, these two that I've highlighted really show where secondary sources get involved in the History Day project. Secondary sources are important for all of it, but in particular, secondary sources help us establish wide research. They integrate a body of credible research into a fully developed historical argument, and they also help us develop multiple perspectives. This integrates multiple perspectives throughout the historical argument in our History Day projects. Yeah, so that's a great question. Your teachers will grade it a little differently in their classroom because every teacher is going to have different goals for how History Day works in their own classroom. This is kind of the like national guideline. And most often, the way your teachers grade it in your classroom will help you make a better project, even if it doesn't follow this rubric exactly. So I want to show you guys a little bit of an example of a secondary source in practice, right? So what does a secondary source look like, and how does a secondary source analyze primary sources in a way that gives us multiple perspectives and historical context? So I am going to stop sharing so I can go to my different web browser for a second. And when I share again, if you guys could just pop in the chat again and let me know if you can see this new page I'm going to share. Can you guys see that in the chat? If you just let me know if you can see that. I always like to check in because I know that screen sharing can be kind of finicky. How does that look for people? Oh, and I think my internet is maybe having a little bit of trouble.
We can see it, Grace.
Okay, great. It's going a little slow for me, so I wasn't sure what you guys were getting. Okay, awesome. So this is an example of a secondary source from the Library of Congress. And it is talking about the American Revolution and the Boston Tea Party. And it takes two primary sources, two different comics, really, two different drawings, or like political cartoons, and analyzes them. So the first one we're seeing right here is from, it's kind of a critique of Americans from London and Britain and in the UK. And so we get to see how this secondary source shows us a primary source, and then also shows us more outside information about that primary source. This is information that we can't get just from looking at the primary source. It tells us more about what kinds of acts and what kinds of people this primary source is critiquing, and it also tells us a bit more about other things happening at that moment in history. So that's a great way that secondary sources can be extremely useful for History Day projects. And then we can see too the ways that this author has compared the two different pieces and compared the two perspectives. So it's allowing us to see multiple perspectives and how another historian is going to analyze those multiple perspectives. In addition, we can get some additional sources from this Learn More section. Some secondary sources will have Learn More, or they'll have other resources, or they'll have different kinds of citations. And all of those can help us find more, just more content about our History Day projects. So it's always good to be able to look at those for a second. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my presentation, bounce through real quick. Okay, and we're back. I'm gonna try to pull the chat back up. Okay, yeah, okay, got someone else was seeing that my computer was kind of slow, but hopefully it's back on it. Sometimes my house doesn't always get the best Wi-Fi, so I apologize for that. Okay, let's see if I can change. Okay, so now we had a question earlier, right, about how to look for credible sources. And a part of sources is understanding secondary sources and primary sources, is understanding the bias involved in sources. So just like primary sources, secondary sources can introduce bias. Bias is really any time that there's an unbalanced opinion. So every person and every source has bias involved. So if a source has bias, it doesn't mean that it's not worth using or that it isn't allowed in a History Day project. All that it really means is that you should be aware of that bias. So it's important for students and for everyone making History Day projects to think about the bias of their sources that you're using. So what that can mean is that you think critically about and be aware of your bias so you can better understand your topic. So you can think about what does someone's argument mean, or why might this person have written about this topic, or why might they have covered this kind of content. So we really get to see the ways that secondary sources give us a lot of opportunities to understand more. And another thing too that secondary sources can help is they're also often going to look at the bias in primary sources. So secondary sources are going to be aware of other kinds of bias as well. And so they can help you understand more about the bias from different kinds of different historical moments. So we can think about how we look for good sources, right? I have quotes on good because I think good can be really defined in a lot of different ways. What do you guys think I mean when I say a good source? What do you think about that? Oh, I have a question too about bias. Yeah, so Kennedy asked, does every kind of source have an amount of bias? And definitely, every source has bias in it. And that's why it's not that we shouldn't use biased sources. We just have to be aware of the bias in every source. We have to know that there might be bias. Okay, and I'm getting some great things about good sources, right? How credible and how reliable. A really great one I got was how verifiable. Can it be verified? .orgs, .govs, and .edus. Yeah, exactly. .coms aren't always the best options. Yeah, so there's a lot of little hints we can look for, right? To think about how something might be a good source. Yeah, it's written by people who've actually done research, who've done more critical historical work, and not just like wrote something randomly. That's a great one. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we can think about what makes a good source. So these are some go-to hints that I use. So I studied history in college. I really love history. I've done a lot of historical research, and I've done a lot of research online. That's something that's newer in the field, something that as the internet has grown, right, our ability to do secondary source research online has grown a lot as well. So there's opportunities to find things on things like Google Books or Google Scholar. You can find things in your school's library. Maybe your school, like media specialist, will help you out with that. There's online databases like JSTOR and ProQuest. Those can be a little more complicated to access, but they can be good options as well. Like someone mentioned in the chat, government websites or other kinds of more credible websites that end in things like .gov, .edu. .gov is for government, .edu is for educational resources. .si is the Smithsonian Institution. That's what theirs ends in. So that one's really helpful. The Smithsonian's, like you guys probably know, are all the museums in DC. Additionally, I think it can be really nice to use secondary sources from newspapers. Sometimes newspapers will write historical articles and they'll do a good job like sharing some other sources as well. Another thing that they do sometimes is book reviews. So if I find a historical book, but I can't find the book itself, sometimes I'll read a book review about that. Those are all good examples. Yeah, Audrey mentioned whitehousehistory.org. That's a great one as well. That's a good .org option. .orgs can sometimes be tricky. And so we shouldn't use the of the website like gov.edu as like end all be all, whether it's good or bad, but it can be helpful for us in understanding whether it's credible or not. So this is a test I really like. It's called the CRAP test. It's funny. I like the funny name. And I think it's easy to remember. So it kind of asks us some questions about secondary sources. We're saying, is it current? That's someone mentioned that in the chat, whether it's timely. Was it written recently enough to be accurate? Has it been revised or updated? If you're looking at a website online, do all the links work? Does the website look well designed? Does it look new? Or does it look kind of old and clunky? And then for the R, is it relevant? Does the information relate to your topic or answer your question? Who's the intended audience? Have you checked other sources to make sure yours is the most relevant to your topic? So you want to make sure it really connects to what you're talking about for your History Day project. The first A, is it authoritative? That's kind of a big word, but it basically means who wrote, or published, or publicized it. Is it like written by an expert? Ask the question, how recent does it have to be for you to put in the project? There's not really a like specific timeline for a secondary source. It can really happen at, it doesn't have to be written at a certain time, but I like to try to think, has there been a lot of new research done since it was made? But generally secondary sources can come from any time between when your historical event happened and today. but ones that are more recent might have more information because there's been more historical research about them. Okay, the next A is it accurate, right? Is there supporting evidence? Has the information been reviewed by experts or fact checkers? Are there spelling or other errors? Sometimes if you find a website online and there's a lot of spelling errors or a lot of broken links, that can be a hint that it might not be the most accurate. Someone might not have spent a lot of time putting that research together. And also, what do other experts say about it? So do other people talk about this resource? Do other people look at it? That can help decide if it maybe has some accuracy. And then finally, what's the purpose? And when we're looking at this question of what's the purpose, this can help us understand bias a little bit too. Why was the information created? Was it promoted to sell something? Or was it promoted for some kind of specific reason? What biases can you find? What are other authors saying about this source? So that's kind of a walkthrough that I really like to use. Those are questions I like to ask myself when I'm looking at a source. And ways that I can try to think about whether a source is going to have good information or not. I think really visually means a lot to me. So like a lot of really reliable sources are going to kind of look more neat. What are other newspapers that are reliable? So a lot of newspapers are reliable, like the Baltimore Sun is one that's great. There's a lot online. I think generally what I like to think about is if it seems like a bigger newspaper, like if it's one you maybe have heard of before, or if their website is pretty big or pretty extensive, that can be helpful. The Washington Post is a newspaper that's reliable. That's great. The Boston Globe, the New York Times, all of those are examples of newspapers that are reliable. And again, something I think that's important to think about with secondary sources is that if you can find it in multiple places, if multiple reliable sources say this information, that's a great way to measure whether a source might be credible or reliable. And that kind of gets into that word verify, right? That verifiable word. So what I like to think about when I think about verifying is I like to think about being a detective. Anytime I'm doing secondary research, I'm going to look for clues to decide I looked for clues to be critical of what I'm finding. So I want to say, maybe I know that I know that women got the vote in the early 1900s in the United States. So if I find a resource that says women were able to vote in the early 1800s, I might not think that the source is very reliable, right? I'm going to verify what I'm finding and verify based on what I already know to be true. So that way you can kind of see if something seems evidence-based and accurate and help use that to understand more about my topic and understand more about the secondary source I'm looking at and whether it's credible. So I want to walk through with you guys some popular online resources. These are resources that can be really useful. I know sometimes we talk about online resources as being not as reliable, but I think they're a really great place to start. What I like to think about is Wikipedia and Google Books and Google Scholar as being places to start, but not necessarily finish our research. I want to use them in order to get started and know more about my project, especially at the beginning, and then push forward to find more secondary sources in other places. So I know for me, when I was in middle school, I was definitely told not to use Wikipedia. And I think it's really important to be really critical of Wikipedia and not take anything from Wikipedia for granted. So, right, anyone can edit on Wikipedia. Wikipedia isn't reliable all the time. Encyclopedia Britannica is okay. It also is not always the perfect source. But what I kind of like to think about, just like any secondary source, is they're the first step. So Wikipedia is a really great place to start your research. It's a great place to maybe get a general idea and then push further to get more research materials that are from more reliable sources. So Erin cut me to the punch. She said, can't you use Wikipedia sources? And that's exactly right. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that here. So when you're using Wikipedia, so say I was doing a project about women's suffrage in the United States, the top of the page is going to look like this, right? It gives us this little intro, and then it might have a photo. Maybe it's got some information. But if I scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see things like resources, bibliographies, and external links at the ends of articles. And that's really where I like to look at the most clearly. So I want to go and see How has Wikipedia gathered this information? And if it's something that isn't cited in Wikipedia, I might not use it. I might try to find that somewhere else. But things like seeing the PBS American Experience documentary, that's great. National Women's Party, a year-by-year history, that's really useful. Different books that are important to think about, Votes for Women, The Struggle for Suffrage Revisited, all of those are great examples. Oh, I got a notification that I couldn't be heard. Can you guys tell me if you can hear me? Can you just post in the chat if you can hear me? Okay, some people can hear me again. Okay, great. For a second, I know I glitched out, so I wanted to check in that I could hear folks. Thanks so much, everyone. I appreciate you letting me know that you can still hear me. So we're having some good thinking about how Wikipedia works, right? We're seeing that Wikipedia can be a place where we can find some misinformation, so some information that might not be true. We can find other information that's really helpful. So I want to show you guys an example that works. So we see the references, the bibliography, and the external links. And say I read this paragraph, right? I looked at this and I said, okay, I want to know more about the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I'm reading that it was established in 1873 and worked for women's suffrage, but I want to know a little bit more. And you'll see that there's a citation at the end, those little 2 and 3. And those you can click, and you can also use them to look at the bottom of the page. And you can use that citation to find specifically where Wikipedia got that information. So here you can see, all right, they cited 2 and 3, and they found that in this book, Drugs in American Society, and in this encyclopedia page, Philanthropy in America, a comprehensive historical encyclopedia. So those are great ways to figure out whether Wikipedia is giving you reliable information. And that's kind of doing this detective work into a secondary source. It's that verifying information, making sure that we're really getting, digging to where, so like almost like beneath the surface, right? So Wikipedia is up here. It's got this big information at the top, but we want to push it a little bit further and see where they found that information. And if you're using a Wikipedia page and you can't find it citing something else, I try to find that information somewhere else. I don't want to use Wikipedia as the end point. I just want to use it as a starting point for my research. Yeah, so I think the basic takeaway is that Wikipedia can be reliable sometimes. It's not always going to be perfect, and I don't want you shouldn't be like citing Wikipedia in your History Day project, but you can use Wikipedia as a jumping off point. It's a point to get started and move further. You never want to take something from Wikipedia and put it directly into your project, but you can take something from Wikipedia and find where they found it and find kind of trace the steps of that information and use those instead. Exactly. The links from the Wikipedia page can be useful. And it's kind of similar with Google Books. Google Books is a little different than Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia, anyone can edit, anybody can share anything. Google Books you can go to and you can search something like the women's suffrage movement in Ireland. That's a great example of if you were kind of still in the broad range part, but you wanted to know more background about women's suffrage. So Google Books really can show a lot of information. It can be really big. It can get a lot of information. It's going to show us like all these different kinds of books. And sometimes it can be a little overwhelming, but it does give this really great opportunity to preview books. You can click this little button called preview, which is you can see in like my search bar on the left. And then on the right, you can see a preview of this book, The Women's Suffrage Movement in Britain and Ireland. And then you can search inside that book. One of the things in Google Books is you often don't get every single page. But if you know you're like want to focus on a certain person or focus on a certain time, you can research that person's name or that organization's name in this little search bar at the top of the page. And that search bar will help you find stuff within the book more specifically. So you might be able to read the one chapter or the couple pages that cover a certain person you want to know more about. So that's how I like to use Google Books. It can also help you if you decide, oh, I really want to use this book, but I can't read all of it on Google Books. You can try to find it in your local library or maybe your school's library as well. And then I like to share Google Scholar because I think it's helpful. Google Scholar can be a little overwhelming. It has everything from science articles to more complicated history articles, but also books. And one of the things that I think is the best part about Google Scholar that is really helpful is being able to sort by relevance, but also being able to click this checkbox and say include citations. And so then we can see for certain books how many people cite these books. So like on the first one, we can see that this book has been cited by 154 other books. The one below it has been cited by 335. So if we're seeing that it's been cited by that many other people, that often means that there's a level of reliability to it. Other people have decided that this source is verified and useful, and can be used by a lot of different people, and has been kind of figured out that these sources have verifiable and reliable information. So some other opportunities to find secondary sources, this is kind of getting into like a next level of digging deeper for research. It's moving a little bit further past just Googling things. This is going on to more specific websites and looking for the secondary sources they include. So a lot of these are blogs. I think blogs given by trusted institutions can be really helpful. A lot of museums, archives, libraries, other institutions like that share blog posts written by staff members about a lot of different subjects. So Library of Congress has really great history blogs. The secondary source I showed you guys earlier is an example of one of those. A lot of museums will have blogs. So you can look up these kinds of things and find secondary source information about your project on this. So not every project might have a blog about it, but a lot of topics might have, a lot of your History Day topics might have been talked about by other places as well, and by other staff at these places. They might have written a blog post, or they might have written an article about it. Smithsonian Magazine is an example, and they'll share a lot more information. So I'm not going to go into these because there's so many of them, but these are a few examples that I like to go to when I'm looking for secondary sources. Another place to find online sources are online exhibits, especially right now as everyone's been doing way more virtual work. Obviously, you know, we're doing this presentation on Zoom. A lot of museums and libraries have put more and more of their historical information onto virtual exhibits. And so I mean, I imagine a lot of you guys have been to like a museum exhibit, right? You might have seen a museum exhibit. Maybe you can, you know, you can read the information on the walls. You can read the information about different pieces of art or different historical pieces. A lot of museums now are putting that online as well. So those are really great places to find more historical information, and find more secondary source information. Yeah, there's the Natural History Museum. The Smithsonian's have a lot of really great online work. The ones I've included here are an exhibit from the Library of Congress, an exhibit from the Brandywine River Museum of Art, and the National Women's History Museum. And so you can find museums from all over the country that will have really great exhibitions. Sometimes what you can do is you can say you wanted to do, right, we had someone who's doing their topic was Josephine Baker. So you could look up Josephine Baker online museum exhibition, and that might help you find good secondary and good primary sources about Josephine Baker. And then you can cite those exhibits in your History Day project. Yeah, so I was spoke at the exact same time as the question I just got in the chat. So for a museum, when you cite those, it can be kind of complicated, but basically you're just going to want to include the name of the exhibit and the name of the institution, so the name like Library of Congress or Brandywine River Museum of Art, and then also a URL to the exhibit. Those mostly are the key parts to citing a museum exhibition. And if you want more specific instructions, your teacher can help you with that as well. But generally, it's going to be pretty similar to how you cite a website. So when we're doing this searching, I wanted to talk to you guys about some like search tips. Oh, I just dropped my notebook. You guys probably heard that. So search tips can be really helpful if you want to narrow down your search. So something like, say you were doing your project about Martin Luther. Martin Luther is a 16th century monk who started the Reformation. But obviously we know the name Martin Luther King as well, right? So if you look at Martin Luther, you might get a lot of examples about Martin Luther King. So you can use quotation marks to narrow down to either one. So you can narrow down to just Martin Luther King or just Martin Luther. The quotation marks will kind of search for multiple words at a time. So it's the same way if you wanted to search for the women's suffrage movement in Ireland and you wanted your sources to all say women's suffrage movement in Ireland, you could use the quotation marks around that. At the same time, there's things like using different names and historical terms. So if you're writing about World War I, that's been called a lot of different things. So when you're searching for it, it might be helpful to use different terms for that search. There's other smart searching tips that I don't want to kind of like numb you down, but this is a good one to take notes on or think about if it's helpful. You can take a screenshot of this. I really like the smart search tips. I think they're really useful, but I want to go into a couple more that are good as well. I love Control F. Control F is like my go-to. It's really useful for exhibit websites or blogs. You can skip down exactly to where maybe the name of the historical figure you want to look for is on the page. You can do this in Google Books as well. In addition, you can use words like and, or not to help narrow your results. So like the Martin Luther King example I was showing you earlier, if you wanted to write a project on Martin Luther and not Martin Luther King, you can say Martin Luther, not King, and you'll only get results that have Martin Luther in them. So that's a great way that you can use those kinds of search terms to narrow things out. In addition, this is one that's my favorite. I actually learned this just a couple months ago. It was really fun for me to learn. You can look something up and just say cite, like cite.si. So I'm going to show you guys this one because it's one of my favorites. And you can use this to limit, I'm going to change the screen real quick. You can use this to limit what you're searching to just a certain kind of website. So similarly to how we looked earlier, right, at, I thought I had a page open for some reason. So similar to how we looked earlier, right, like how .gov is helpful or .si, when you're searching on Google, you can do something like looking up women's suffrage, and you can say cite loc.gov. And then all of the results you're going to get in your Google search are going to be from the Library of Congress. And so that's a really great way to just get rid of all the other stuff on the internet. You don't need to see it. You only want to see stuff from reliable sources. You only want to see stuff from Library of Congress. You only want to see something from the Smithsonian Institution. You can see this cite tool. And that can help you out too. You can only see, so like say you only wanted to get .orgs, right? So that's kind of, still Wikipedia shows up. That's why one of the reasons the .org isn't maybe the most useful piece. I think .loc.gov is one of the most helpful ones. But those are all really great ways to look through more reliable sources just using Google as well, that kind of site search. Okay, I'm going to go back to my presentation, bounce it around a bit. Okay, I'm going to pull the chat back up so I can keep seeing. I appreciate you guys all asking questions in the chat. I can see that Leah's helping you guys out with some of them. The other big tip for me when I'm thinking about doing great online research is keeping track of your sources. I personally really like to make a bookmarks folder and just save everything on that. On my computer, I can just press Control D and it gets dropped into a bookmarks folder. Other people I know like to keep notes on like just old-fashioned pen and paper. Some people like online tools like Noodle Tools or OneNote. I also know that Google Keep works for some people. At the end of the day, you can really do whatever works best for you. But keeping track of sources throughout your whole research process is going to be really helpful. It's really easy to lose track of a website. Like you find something and the next day you can't get back to it somehow, especially as you're doing online research. So definitely marking down everything that you find and keeping track of them so you don't lose them later on in your project Another thing that can be helpful to help with your annotated bibliography is making citations as you go. Sometimes it can feel kind of like a pain at the time, but at the end, oh, Roman just gave a great tip. Going into your search history can help if you lose a source. Yeah, and Audrey asked a question about what sometimes you might have a site and the next day it isn't working, and that can kind of just suck, right? It kind of is annoying. It's not always the best option. It's not always great, but it does happen. I think that's kind of the weakness of online research sometimes. That's another reason to take notes, not just on what, like where you found something, but also what you found, what information you might be found. Yeah, and it looks like maybe some folks are dropping in some chat, some ways that they keep track of their sources. So I appreciate that. And you can find a little bit more about secondary sources on our online resources. We've got these modules called ThinkPort. And if you go to this link, thinkport.org/TPS/module1, it will tell you a little bit more about how using primary and secondary sources in the classroom can be helpful, and also how secondary sources can be located and cited in your History Day projects. In addition, if you scan this on your phone camera, or you could follow, or you look up at our website, there's in Maryland History Day's website, you can go to student resources, and we also have a finding sources page there. And that gives a lot of those like museum sources and other Maryland sources. It shows some local libraries. It has some Baltimore libraries listed. So that can be a great way for folks to look for more resources and finding sources on Maryland History Day's website. Yeah, the QR code is fun. You can do it on your phone just with a camera, but I'll also share this link in the chat in a second, the chat that it goes to as well, the different research sources. Great, so thanks so much for listening. I know I kind of chatted for a while, and I think there's been some good questions in the chat. So I want to open up at like the last part of this for talking more about any particular questions folks have. And I really appreciate you guys sticking through the presentation. I'm gonna stop sharing now so I can grab that link real quick. And then we can go into asking some questions as a group as well.
So I've just posted the link of the QR code that Grace just had up on the screen. So
Thanks,
this goes to, yeah, no problem. This goes to our website and some resources for students. And so when you scroll down, you'll see that there are a couple different tabs for different parts of the project. Oh, did I post it? Nope.
If you don't have any questions at the moment, that's totally okay. But if you have, oh, so this isn't necessarily about secondary sources, but how are interviews in National History Day? Yeah, so interviews are really helpful. They can be helpful if someone is either a historian who has done a lot of research on this topic. They can help you find more sources. They might even be able to be a primary source interview. Maybe they lived through the historical moment you're talking about. And they can be really stressful. I think one thing to remember is most historians who do this kind of research are really excited to share with people about the research they've done. It's something they've devoted a lot of their time to. So they're just going to be excited that you even want to ask or even are interested. So I think even though it can be stressful or nerve-wracking for you, the person who is like hearing from you is probably really excited to talk to you about the research they've done. And especially students, right? People love to share their research with others, and are excited to be able to talk to people about the kind of work they've done. Finding contacts can be really hard. I think sometimes it can be helpful if you can find like content information on like museum websites or on blog posts. But I also think interviews can be helpful, but they aren't the most important part of a research project. If you are struggling to find someone to talk to or you're not sure who to reach out to, it's okay to not have one. They are kind of useful, but it's really hard to find context. And if that's taking too much time, I feel like it's okay to focus on other stuff as well. And if maybe your teacher can help you with contacts too. So primary versus secondary source for interviews can be kind of tricky. A primary source interview can be one if it's about an individual who is alive or who experienced the time you're talking about, but it can be a secondary source if you're talking to someone who just studies the time you're talking about. Does that kind of make sense? I know that's kind of a confusing distinction. Okay, great.
But I
Any
will
other
just
questions?
say,
Oh, yeah.
sorry, I will just
No, go
say
ahead.
that NHD doesn't really recommend using secondary source interviews because they really want you to find that information in your reading. But primary source interviews are always good.
Great. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so a primary source interview, if it's going to help you understand more about the time that you wouldn't be able to find anywhere else, then that can be helpful. But other interviews probably can be kept out. Yeah, secondary sources can be recent. They don't have to be recent, but the more recent they are, sometimes the more information they'll be able to give you. I missed your question on topics, Soraya. What question was that? Can you type it again? Sorry that I didn't see it. Oh, wait, I see it now. As far as topics, could you talk a little bit about that? Would we have to do topics talking about a person, or could it be things that talk about communication in general? Yeah, so you can talk about any kind of communication that you want. It doesn't have to be about a person. It could be about an event. It could be about a type of communication. Earlier today, some of the folks who came a little bit early to the chat were talking about there are different kinds of projects, like projects on the Pony Express and projects about communication in anime and projects about the invention of the telegram. So there's a lot of different approaches that can be taken to our topic decisions. They don't have to be just about a person. Yeah, so if you're interested in talking about Black culture in the 1920s, that's a really great place to start. Sometimes that might be a little broad. It might be helpful to narrow it down to just photographs or just music or just books or the Harlem Renaissance. Maybe you want to narrow it down to a specific city or a specific person, but definitely Black culture in the 1920s is a great place to start. That's really interesting. Yeah, for the projects this year, it's going to be a little funky, but displaying them we're going to share them via online. So sharing them, you're going to be able to upload your project and share it with your judges that way. Yeah, and if you don't have any questions, I got a question. If you don't have any questions, you can feel free to go. You don't have to stay till the end if you don't have questions. Just stay on if you still have questions or want to hear us answer questions from other people. Yeah, I got a question privately about the Tulsa race riot. Or the race massacre? Is that going to be a great, and that would be a really great topic to cover.